Kids, that is. Adults, you have to stay here. You can be dismissed. Genesis chapter 40. If you're following along in a pew Bible, it is on page 31. Sometime after this, the cupbearer of the king of Egypt and his baker committed an offense against their lord, the king of Egypt. And Pharaoh was angry with his two officers, the chief cupbearer and the chief baker, and he put them in custody in the house of the captain of the guard in the prison where Joseph was confined. The captain of the guard appointed Joseph to be with them, and he attended them, and they continued for some time in custody. And one night they both dreamed, the cupbearer and the baker of the king of Egypt, who were confined in prison, each his own dream and each with its own interpretation. When Joseph came to them in the morning, he saw that they were troubled. So he asked Pharaoh's officers who were with him in custody in his master's house, "Why are your faces downcast today?" They said to him, "We have had dreams, and there is no one to interpret them." And Joseph said to them, "Do not interpretations belong to God? Please tell them to me." So the chief cupbearer and told his dream to Joseph and said to him, "In my dream there was a vine before me, and on the vine there were 3 branches, and as soon as it budded, its blossoms shot forth, and the clusters ripened into grapes. And Pharaoh's cup was in my hand, and I took the grapes and pressed them into Pharaoh's cup and placed the cup in Pharaoh's hand." Then Joseph said to him, "This is its interpretation. The 3 branches are 3 days. In 3 days Pharaoh will lift up your head and restore you to your office, and you shall place Pharaoh's cup in his hands as formerly when you were his cupbearer. Only remember me when it is well with you, and please do me the kindness to mention me to Pharaoh, and so get me out of this house. For I was indeed stolen out of the land of the Hebrews, and here I also have done nothing that they should put me into the pit." When the chief baker saw that the interpretation was favorable, he said to Joseph, "I also had a dream. There were 3 cake baskets on my head, and in the uppermost basket there were all sorts of baked food for Pharaoh. But the birds were eating it out of the basket on my head." And Joseph answered and said, "This is its interpretation. The 3 baskets are 3 days. In 3 days Pharaoh will lift up your head from you and hang you on a tree, and the birds will eat the flesh from you. On the 3rd day, which was Pharaoh's birthday, he made a feast for all of his servants and lifted up the head of the chief cupbearer and the head of the chief baker among his servants. He restored the chief cupbearer to his position, and he placed the cup in Pharaoh's hand. But he hanged the chief baker as Joseph had interpreted to them. Yet the chief cupbearer did not remember Joseph, but forgot him. After 2 whole years, Pharaoh dreamed that he was standing by the Nile, and behold, there came up out of the Nile 7 cows, attractive and plump, and they fed in the reed grass. And behold, 7 other cows, ugly and thin, came up out of the Nile after them, and stood by the other cows on the bank of the Nile. And the ugly, thin cows ate up the 7 attractive, plump cows, and Pharaoh awoke. And he fell asleep and dreamed a second time. And behold, 7 ears of grain, plump and good, were growing on a stalk. And behold, after them sprouted up 7 ears, thin and blighted by the east wind. And the thin ears swallowed up the 7 plump, full ears. And Pharaoh awoke, and behold, it was a dream. So in the morning his spirit was troubled, and he sent and he called for the magicians of Egypt and all its wise men. Pharaoh told them his dreams, but there was none who could interpret them to Pharaoh. Then the chief cupbearer said to Pharaoh, "I remember my offense today. When Pharaoh was angry with his servants and put me and the chief baker in custody in the house of the captain of the guard, we dreamed on the same night, he and I, each having a dream with its own interpretation. A young Hebrew was there with us, a servant of the captain of the guard, and when we told him, he interpreted our dreams to us, giving us an interpretation to each man according to his dream. And as he interpreted to us, so it came about. I was restored to my office, and the baker was hanged. Then Pharaoh sent and called Joseph, and they quickly brought him out of the pit. And when he had shaved himself and changed his clothes, he came before Pharaoh, and Pharaoh said to Joseph, I have had a dream, and there is no one who can interpret it. I have heard it said of you that when you hear a dream, you can interpret it. And Joseph answered Pharaoh, it is not in me. God will give Pharaoh a favorable answer. Then Pharaoh said to Joseph, behold, in my dream I was standing on the banks of the Nile. 7 cows, plump and attractive, came up out of the Nile and fed in the reed grass. 7 other cows came up after them, poor and very ugly and thin, such that I've never seen in all the land of Egypt. And the thin, ugly cows ate up the first 7 plump cows. But when they had eaten them, no one would have known that they had eaten them, for they were still as ugly as the beginning. And then I awoke. I also saw in my dream 7 ears growing on one stalk, full and good. 7 ears withered, thin, and blighted by the east wind sprouted up after them. And the thin ears swallowed up the 7 good ears. And I told it to the magicians, but there was no one who could explain it to me. Then Joseph said to Pharaoh, the dreams of the Pharaoh are one. God has revealed to Pharaoh what he is about to do. The 7 good cows are 7 years, and the 7 good ears are 7 years, and the dreams are one. The 7 lean and ugly cows that came up after them are 7 years, and the 7 empty ears blighted by the east wind are also 7 years of famine. It is as I told Pharaoh, God has shown to Pharaoh what he is about to do. There will come 7 years of great plenty throughout all the land of Egypt. But after them there will arise 7 years of famine, and all the plenty will be forgotten in the land of Egypt. The famine will consume the land, and the plenty will be unknown in the land by reason of the famine that will follow, for it will be very severe. And the doubling of Pharaoh's dream means that the thing is fixed by God, and God will shortly bring it about. Now therefore, let Pharaoh select a discerning and wise man and set him over the land of Egypt. Let Pharaoh proceed to appoint overseers over the land and take 1/5 of the produce of the land of Egypt during the 7 plentiful years. And let them gather all the food of these good years that are coming and store up grain under the authority of Pharaoh for food in the cities, and let them keep it. That food shall be a reserve for the land against the 7 years of famine that are to occur in the land of Egypt, so that the land may not perish through the famine. This proposal pleased Pharaoh and all his servants. And Pharaoh said to his servants, can we find a man like this in whom is the Spirit of God? Then Pharaoh said to Joseph, since God has shown you all this, there is none so discerning and wise as you are. You shall be over my house, and all my people shall order themselves as you command. Only as regards to the throne will I be greater than you. And Pharaoh said to Joseph, see, I have set you over the land of Egypt. And then Pharaoh took his signet ring from his hand and put it on Joseph's hand, and clothed him in garments of fine linen, and put a gold chain about his neck. And he made him ride in the second chariot, and they called out before him, bow the knee. Thus he set him over all the land of Egypt. Moreover, Pharaoh said to Joseph, I am Pharaoh, and without your consent no one shall lift up a hand or foot in all the land of Egypt. And Pharaoh called Joseph's name Zephanath-Paneah, and he gave him in marriage Asenath, the daughter of Potiphera, priest of On. So Joseph went out over the land of Egypt. Joseph was 30 years old when he entered the service of Pharaoh, the king of Egypt. Joseph went out from the presence of Pharaoh and went through all the land of Egypt. During the 7 plentiful years, the earth produced abundantly, and he gathered up all the food of these 7 years which occurred in the land of Egypt, and put the food in the cities. He put in every city the food from the fields around it. And Joseph stored up grain in great abundance, like the sand of the sea, until he ceased to measure it, for it could not be measured. Before the year of famine came, 2 sons were born to Joseph. Asenath, the daughter of Potiphera, priest of On, bore them to him. Joseph called the name of the firstborn Manasseh, for he said, God has made me forget all my hardship and all my father's house. The name of the second he called Ephraim, for God has made me fruitful in the land of my affliction. The 7 years of plenty and all that occurred in the land of Egypt came to an end, and the 7 years of famine began to come, as Joseph had said. There was famine in all the lands, but in all the land of Egypt there was bread. When all the land of Egypt was famished, the people cried to Pharaoh for bread. Pharaoh said to all the Egyptians, "Go to Joseph. What he says to you, do." So when the famine had spread all over the land, Joseph opened up all the storehouses and sold to the Egyptians, for the famine was severe in the land of Egypt. Moreover, all the earth came to Egypt to Joseph to buy grain, because the famine was severe over all the earth. Let's pray. Lord, thank you for your word. Thank you for preserving this record of Joseph's life and how you demonstrate your sovereignty over the earth, over kings, and you exalt the humble. Guide us as we think about this text now in Jesus' name. Amen. You ever wonder what in the world God is doing? I mean, why does he allow certain things to happen to you? I mean, you ever thought, what good will come of this difficulty that I find myself in? You know, I think that all of us at some point, we're going to think this way. There are times when we can only see good things by looking back, looking at how God worked. But in other circumstances, we may never know why God allowed what he did. I think the one thing that Christians can rest in is that no matter what, God is with us and is for us and is doing his good work with us and in us. I would bet that Joseph, at several points in his life, wondered what God was doing. His life has been something of a roller coaster, highs and lows. He's the favorite son. He was charged with the oversight of his brothers, and then he went to being thrown in the pit and then sold into slavery. He was a favorite servant, given control of Potiphar's household, and he went to being lied about and thrown into a prison. But even in prison, as we saw last week, God was with him and was blessing him and was causing him to succeed. And Joseph was faithful, making the best of a bad situation. He's holding on to those promises that God gave to him that were embedded in his two dreams, that one day he would be exalted. But not yet. God is still preparing Joseph as he goes from a prison to a palace. I think the main idea that we see in this passage this morning is that the faithful will be exalted. Here's the kicker: in due time. The faithful will be exalted in due time. There are two things that I want us to see in both, one thing in chapter 40, one thing in chapter 41. In chapter 40, I want us to see that God uses low points to cultivate faithfulness. And then in chapter 41, I want us to see that faithfulness prepares God's people for that moment when he exalts them. So, the main idea, the faithful will be exalted in due time. God's going to use low points to cultivate that faithfulness. And then that faithfulness is going to prepare his people, God's people, for exaltation. So let's work through chapter 40. God uses low points to cultivate faithfulness. Chapter 39 ended with Joseph in prison. It's not your normal prison story with a guy locked behind bars, playing the harmonica, singing Johnny Cash. And Joseph has actually become a resident prison manager. And he's been successful even under these circumstances. And we also have to keep in mind that refrain that we saw in chapter 39 that tells us why Joseph was so successful in Egypt. That phrase, the Lord was with him. While that is true, and one could ask for no more than that, it doesn't mean that it wasn't hard. Prison is prison after all. And now in chapter 40, we see that he's been there for a while, but things appear to be moving. In chapter 40, verse 1, sometime after this, the cupbearer of the king of Egypt and his baker committed an offense against their lord, the king of Egypt. And Pharaoh was angry with his two officers, the chief cupbearer and the chief baker, and he put them in custody in the house of the captain of guard. In the prison where Joseph was confined. So, two of Pharaoh's chief officers in powerful positions in Pharaoh's administration commit an offense. And literally that means sin. They committed a sin. They committed a sin worthy of being thrown into prison. Now, since both of these guys were the chiefs of their respective branches of service, it might be reasonable to assume that they had considerable control over everything that Pharaoh ate and Pharaoh drank. Okay. So think about it. The cupbearer, his life in particular is at stake by the very nature of his job. So he would have controlled the logistics of all the food preparation, not only to protect Pharaoh, but this is to preserve his own life. Now, it may be that, again, imagination here a little bit, it may be that an attempt was made on Pharaoh's life through the kitchen. In other words, he might have been poisoned, or an attempt to be poisoned. And a plot was discovered before it was successful, and that might be what landed both the cupbearer and the baker in prison until the investigation was complete. It's a possibility. The scriptures don't tell us, but when you put together all of the pieces, it seems reasonable. But they happened to land in the prison where Joseph was, and where he's confined. And I think that's where we see a hint of providence there. Joseph was responsible for them. And once again, now Joseph is in the company of powerful people. If we pull back and we look at the full story, we can see how this will serve to help Joseph prepare for dealing with Egyptian aristocracy. Right? He's been with Potiphar, the captain of the guard. Now he's with the chief cupbearer, the chief baker. So he is rubbing shoulders with key components of the Egyptian aristocracy. But here in this low point in Joseph's life, God creates this opportunity for Joseph to cultivate faithfulness. And the first thing that I think we see as far as cultivating faithfulness is he's faithful to other people. Joseph walks into the cupbearer and baker's cell. I don't know what the prison looked like. I'm going to say cell, okay? And he sees that they're disturbed. And the night before, each one had a dream, and each dream had its own interpretation. But here's where Joseph is faithful by showing compassion towards those in his care. He asked them, "Why are your faces downcast today?" I mean, aside from the fact that you're in prison. "Why are you sadder than usual?" Maybe that's what it means. But that's compassion, right? Joseph's compassion for the two men is what sets the events in motion that are going to lead to his exaltation. What if Joseph didn't care to ask? What if he was just dismissive? The opportunity to be used by God to interpret the dreams might have passed him by. So let's be compassionate. Let's be compassionate when we see people hurting so we don't pass by an opportunity to be used by God to do good for them. And when those times do come, let's take advantage of them. That's what Joseph does. And the two prisoners answer, we've had dreams, and there's no one to interpret them. So Joseph sees an opportunity to be faithful to others, and now to be faithful to God. He says, Joseph said to them, do not interpretations belong to God? Please tell them to me. And this is where we see Joseph's faithfulness to God. You see, in ancient times, dreams were a primary method through which divine revelation was given. At least that's the way they were perceived in a lot of ways. In the case of the cupbearer and the baker, they were troubled because they didn't have access to the magicians in the court in order to receive the interpretation of their dreams. Joseph acknowledges that, dreams can communicate divine revelations. I mean, having had two dreams himself. But he's careful to acknowledge that God is the source of these interpretations. I mean, given the fact that the Lord has been with him, Joseph seems confident enough in the possibility that God will reveal the interpretation to him as he seeks to hear their dreams. That's faith. So despite this low point in his life, Joseph remains faithful to God. The willingness to explain the cupbearer and the baker's dreams conveys that Joseph hasn't given up on his two dreams. The cupbearer's dream contains positive imagery. You've got branches, you've got blossoms, you've got clusters, ripened grapes, a picture of handing Pharaoh his cup. And Joseph's interpretation corresponds to that. In 3 days, the cupbearer's head will be lifted up. That's a figure of speech that in this case refers to restoration. In other words, the cupbearer is going to be restored to his office. He's going to get his old job back. But look at where Joseph's confidence lies. He's so confident in the Lord that he requests that the cupbearer remember him when he's restored. I don't think you would ask that if you weren't sure that your interpretation was going to be correct. So Joseph says, do me this kindness. And kindness is that same word hesed that was used in chapter 39. It's a Hebrew word, 39:21, when God shows Joseph steadfast love after he was thrown into prison. So Joseph is saying, show me some hesed. Show me this kindness. So he pleads, show me some love when you get out. And then verse 15 gives the reason for the request. He says that he was stolen out of the land of the Hebrews. That is, he views what his brothers did to him as like the equivalent of kidnapping. And regarding his incarceration, he says here also, I have done nothing that they should put me into the pit. In other words, he says, I'm here as the result of injustice. I mean, you can hear the disappointment coming through in these statements. But at the same time, we see that Joseph may be faithful in bad circumstances. And that's true. But he's also trying to get out of them. He's trying to change his circumstances. So I think this is instructive. If you're at a low point, if you're in difficult circumstances, try to do something about it. If you're in bad health, can you do something to change it? Can you eat better, exercise? If you're in a tough work environment, can you transfer? Can you find a different job? Can you change your attitude? Maybe you can change your circumstances, maybe you can't. But you can try and then see what the Lord does. But even if you can't, God's work in Joseph's life shows us that we can still be compassionate. We can still be helpful even when things aren't going well, when our life is not going well. You see, the baker is encouraged by the interpretation that the cupbearer received, so he's eager to tell his dream too. However, in contrast, the baker's dream has negative imagery. Birds eating bread out of the upper basket. I don't know, maybe this interpretation, or maybe this means that the baker didn't do his job well. He didn't protect the basket and the birds are eating it out. But this dream also has a corresponding negative interpretation. The baker's head also is going to be lifted up, but quite literally, lifted up by a noose. And so here again, Joseph is being faithful to God. God gives the interpretation. Joseph has to communicate it faithfully, even though it's not favorable. Sometimes faithfulness requires that we deliver bad news. Think about the gospel. What does the gospel mean? The gospel quite literally means good news, right? But the thing about that is that no one knows what good news is unless what? Unless you know what bad news is. Or you have bad news to compare it to. So if we're to proclaim the good news, if we have to first be faithful to, if we're going to proclaim the good news, we first have to be faithful to explain the bad news, so that good news can be seen as good news. So to fail to give the bad news is to be unfaithful and is a good way to lead someone to hell, again, as it pertains to the gospel. But once again, we see the faithfulness of the Lord to Joseph. Verse 20 and 21 prove once again that the Lord is with Joseph in that his interpretations are correct. It's absolutely correct. So God uses low points in our lives to cultivate faithfulness toward God and toward others. For Joseph, faithfulness to others was expressed in his compassion toward the cupbearer and the baker. Faithfulness to God is expressed in giving him credit for the interpretations and by telling the truth in those interpretations. But that doesn't mean that the low point is over now. Because in verse 23, we read that even though things happened exactly as Joseph said they would, yet the chief cupbearer did not remember Joseph, but forgot him. This situation reminds me of another situation where one person made a request to be remembered by another person. Jesus was a righteous man, crucified between two condemned men. One of those condemned men asked the Lord Jesus to remember him when he came into his kingdom. You think Jesus forgot about him? No. Jesus does not forget or abandon his own. We might be tempted to think that he does. It might feel like it. But though we may suffer for now, he will not forget those of us whose faith rests in him when he comes into his kingdom. That sort of hope will help us come to terms with those low points in our lives. So it is possible. You can come to terms with low points in your life. But though it looked like things were moving in the right direction and Joseph had this glimmer of hope, his time in prison was not yet over, but the Lord was using it to prepare him for the palace. And in chapter 41, we see that faithfulness prepares God's people for exaltation. I love how the narrator builds up the anguish of waiting. He doesn't say just after some time or, after a couple of years. He says after 2 whole years or 2 full years. Yeah, you can almost feel Joseph's disappointment. 2 more years in the clink. Just when it looked like he might have a way out of prison, he has to sit there for 2 more years. But now Pharaoh has a couple dreams of his own. In the first dream, 7 sleek or healthy cows. They come up out of the Nile River to graze in the reed grass. And as they're grazing, 7 lean and altogether unhealthy cows come up out of the Nile. They stand by the healthy cows, and then they proceed to eat them up. That was apparently disturbing enough to cause Pharaoh to wake up. Perhaps it's one of those dreams that is, so vivid. It's vivid enough to wake you up, but not so disturbing that you can't get back to sleep, so Pharaoh falls asleep again. And a second time he dreams that 7 ears of grain sprout up on one stalk, but in a similar fashion to the cows, 7 thin ears, blighted or dried out by the east wind, they swallow up the plump ears. Pharaoh wakes up again. It's a dream. 2 dreams that run along the same lines, and they both disturb Pharaoh. And he wakes up troubled, and he goes and he calls for all of his magicians and wise men. 2 dreams of this nature must be significant. Someone is trying to tell Pharaoh something, and he wants to find out what. Well, unfortunately, none of his magicians or his wise men, they can't figure it out. And so this is where we see God's providence. Pharaoh's dreams actually create the demand for Joseph. And that is what is eventually going to secure his release. Think about it. Had the chief cupbearer remembered Joseph right away without that demand there, without the demand that was caused by the dreams, Pharaoh just might have ignored Joseph. Who cares about a Hebrew? But now the cupbearer has a providential memory jog. It hits him like a ton of bricks, and he says to Pharaoh, I remember my offense today. And then he goes on to tell him about the young Hebrew who served the captain of the guard, and that was able to accurately interpret both his and the baker's dreams, and that both interpretations came true, just as Joseph had said. So Pharaoh immediately calls for Joseph. They quickly bring him out of the pit. And again, the narrator uses this great imagery to remind us of Joseph's plight and his being thrown into the pit. They call him out of the pit. He was thrown into the pit by his brothers. He was sold into slavery. He ascended to the chief manager in Potiphar's house, and then he was falsely accused and thrown into the pit of prison. So you have exaltation, pit, exaltation, pit. And now they're bringing him out of the pit. He is resurrected, if you will, once again. And now Joseph is standing before Pharaoh. And Pharaoh says to him in verse 15, I have had a dream, and there is no one who can interpret it. I have heard it said of you that when you hear a dream, you can interpret it. Now, Joseph's response is in large part a product of all that he's learned through suffering and abuse. There are at least 2 ways that the low points in Joseph's life have cultivated faithfulness in him that have prepared him for this moment. The first one is that the low points have cultivated faithfulness expressed in humility. Look at the first words out of Joseph's mouth when he answers Pharaoh. It is not within me. He doesn't claim to have any special power in and of himself. He admits that he does not own or control the ability to interpret dreams. And that leads us to the second aspect of Joseph's faithfulness. The low points have cultivated this faithfulness expressed in the acknowledgement of God's absolute sovereignty. He says, God will give Pharaoh a favorable answer. That is, God will tell you what the truth is concerning your dreams. But that's not the only acknowledgement. Look at how many times Joseph acknowledges God's sovereignty. Verse 25, the dreams of Pharaoh are one. God has revealed to Pharaoh what he's about to do. Verse 28, it is as I told Pharaoh, God has shown to Pharaoh what he's about to do. Verse 32, and the doubling of Pharaoh's dream means that the thing is surely fixed by God. And God will shortly bring it about. You see that? These are pretty significant expressions of God's sovereignty from someone who has experienced real low points in his life, including his current situation in prison. So what do the dreams mean? What is God going to do? The two dreams are one. That is, both dreams illustrate the same event. So for the next 7 years, Egypt is going to see abundant prosperity. That's what the 7 healthy cows and the 7 healthy ears represent. However, at the end of 7 years, is represented by the lean cows, the ugly cows, and the blighted ears of grain. There's going to be a great famine. And the famine is going to consume all of the prosperity gained in the 7 good years. The famine is going to wipe it all out. And so Joseph's faithful answer to Pharaoh is a testimony to the sovereign rule of God. Think about that. That's a risk. Because the two dreams could communicate, or they're a way that God communicates his power over the Egyptian gods. Since cows and crops were vital to the Egyptian survival, and each one had a related deity. Kind of gives us a hint at the plagues coming in Exodus. Through these two dreams, Joseph's God is saying that Egypt's God will not be able to save them from the coming disaster. But Joseph doesn't stop there. He makes a bold move. He goes beyond simply interpreting the dreams to advising on a course of action. And this is where we see Joseph's wisdom. And maybe this is where he's learned a little bit since chapter 40, verses 14 and 15. When he was speaking to the cupbearer, he says, remember me, do me this kindness, mention me to Pharaoh, get me out of this house. Yeah, again, I'm not blaming him for doing this. But look at how he chooses to address Pharaoh. With humility. His approach is indirect. He uses the power of suggestion. In verse 33 he says, now therefore, let Pharaoh select a discerning and wise men and set him over the land of Egypt. And then I just imagine Joseph with his big smile. But you see what he did? He didn't just come out and say, hey, Pharaoh, since I can accurately interpret your dreams, this is what you should appoint me to do. Instead, he just lays it out there for Pharaoh to consider. And now Joseph, he probably thinks he is the best person for the job. I think that's an accurate assessment. And in God's providence, that's exactly what he'll end up doing. But right now, that's not his call. He just lays out a plan. Appoint a wise man to run Operation Food for the Famine. Give him a staff to oversee the collection of 20% of all food production for the next 7 years. Store the food in the cities across Egypt. Hold on to that food until the famine comes. And then that food will be a reserve, or it'll be a hedge against the famine that is surely coming, so that your people don't die. And he just leaves it there. It's Pharaoh's decision now. What will he do with the truth that he's just been given? Look at verse 37. This proposal pleased Pharaoh and all his servants. Now, the fact that they approved of Joseph's interpretation did not change the truth of the situation and the impending famine. It all would have happened even if they didn't believe it. I mean, that's the thing about the truth. Though God gives truth and God's people explain it to others, those who hear the truth still have to come to terms with it, either by accepting it or rejecting it, to their blessing or to their curse. No matter how powerful you think you are, you still have to submit to the sovereign Lord. So if God says that there's an impending disaster coming, say, a day of righteous judgment that will be poured out on sinful people, say, a day of reckoning when you die and stand before the sovereign God of the universe, the outcome of that day will depend on whether or not you have believed what God has said. And this is what God has said. Romans 1:18. For the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men, who by their unrighteousness suppress the truth. Let's be clear. 7 years of famine in Egypt is absolutely nothing. It's nothing in comparison to this coming day. If you slip out of this life, never having heeded this warning, disaster awaits you. An eternal disaster. God's never-ending wrath poured out on you for unconfessed, unrepentant sin. But there is a chance at deliverance. Just like Pharaoh has an opportunity to deliver himself and his people, Paul goes on in Romans chapter 3 to say that everyone's a sinner under condemnation. However, God put his own son, Jesus, forward to die in our place in order to satisfy God's wrath against us. And Paul says in Romans 3:24 through 26 that a sinner can be made righteous and redeemed by the blood of Jesus. And this redemption is a gift to be received by faith. But it's your choice. You have to make that decision. You see, God has shown you what he's about to do. What's your call? Pharaoh's call in regard to God's revelation through Joseph is found in verse 38 through 40. And Pharaoh said to his servants, "Can we find a man like this in whom the Spirit of God is?" Then Pharaoh said to Joseph, "Since God has shown you all of this, there is none so discerning and wise as you are. You shall be over my house and over my people, and shall order themselves, and all my people shall order themselves as you command. Only as regards to the throne will I be greater than you." You see, Pharaoh recognizes the detail and the depth of the interpretation, and that plan can only come from God. And he wisely acts in light of that revelation, the revelation he's received. And Joseph finally, he rises to the place that God has promised through his dreams. In verse 42, you see a reversal of previous events. Clothing is usually stripped from Joseph and used to condemn him. Here he's given clothing and jewelry as a symbol of his elevation. And through this quick ascendance to power, this requires that Pharaoh take Joseph on a tour of Egypt. He's going to introduce him to all of the land and show everyone this new head of state. I think this is serving to help establish Joseph's authority, to gain respect of the people. And verse 44 shows us that the one who is once powerless and subject to the injustices of others, is now in a position where no one can do anything without his approval. And Joseph is given a new name. It's an Egyptian name. He's also given an Egyptian wife, Asenath. She's the daughter of the priest of an Egyptian god, On. And we also find out that Joseph was 30 years old when he entered into Pharaoh's service. So do the math, 13 years have passed since he was sold into slavery. And then we read that Joseph goes about his duty, executing the plan, just as he laid it out. And they take in so much grain that they just stop counting. But now we're faced with a new question. Joseph's got a new job, a new name, a new wife. She's the daughter of a pagan priest. Is Joseph in danger of becoming an Egyptian? Will he end up adopting the immoral culture of Egypt like his brothers did when they were in Canaan? Nope. At no point in Genesis or the rest of Scripture do you ever get the hint that Joseph is faithful to anyone other than God. I think one of the biggest clues that we see this in is in verses 50 through 52. The names of Joseph's two sons that are born to him before the famine. Joseph's sons are given, or he gives his sons Hebrew names. And the meanings of those names are an acknowledgement to what God has done in his life. Manasseh means he who makes one forget. So you see in this naming, it's a Hebrew name that God makes one forget. His disappointment has been replaced with peace. He recognizes God's hand in putting distance between him and all of the hardship that he's faced when he lived with his fathers and his brothers. He's free from their influence and free from the suffering that he endured as a result of their treatment. Ephraim means to make fruitful. The place of suffering has now become the place of blessing. Though his relationship with his family has not been reconciled, I mean, we seem to get the idea that Joseph has come to terms with what has happened to him. And he's moved on with his life. I mean, I think it is interesting. I think we might think that Joseph would be in a position now to find out what has happened to his family. But he doesn't take the initiative to do so. I don't know, maybe there's no point in digging up the past. But even so, he does not forsake his heritage or his God. Then in verses 53 through 57, the 7 years of plenty have ended. 7 years of famine have begun. Again, this appears to be a worldwide famine. The people need bread. Pharaoh sends them to Joseph. Joseph opens up the storehouses. He begins selling the grain. But it's not just Egypt that comes to him for food. All of the earth is experiencing this famine. And all the earth came to Joseph because the famine was severe everywhere. And that's going to set us up for this next event. Joseph may not be seeking out his family, but unknowingly they're going to seek him out. The faithful will be exalted in due time. God uses those low points in our lives to cultivate that faithfulness. It's really a matter of how you respond to it. Faithfulness is preparing God's people for that exaltation. Now, you might not be the second in command of Egypt. I'm pretty much guaranteed that's not going to happen. That exaltation might not come until Jesus returns. For 13 years, all Joseph could do was be faithful to God in whatever situation he found himself to be. Even in highly traumatic situations. So it is. We will be in situations, difficult and traumatic situations, where all we can do is be faithful to God. But it is possible to be faithful. I think Joseph's life shows us that faithfulness is the agent of healing that allows us to deal with those traumas, to embrace what God is doing in our lives. It's preparing us for what God has called us to do. So let's be faithful in times of difficulty. Exercise humility whenever the opportunity presents itself. And don't forget God when successful. I'm going to leave you with this. If you're a follower of Jesus Christ, hold on to this hope right here. 1 Peter 5, 6, and 7, and verse 10. Humble yourselves, therefore, under the mighty hand of God, so that at the proper time he may exalt you, casting all your anxieties on him because he cares for you. And after you've suffered for a little while, the God of all grace, who has called you to his eternal glory in Christ, will himself restore, confirm, strengthen,